Building the Digital Enterprise입니다. PwC 아트 지역 디지털 서비스 리더이신 콜린 라이트 씨를 무대 위로 모시도록 하겠습니다. 여러분 큰 박수로 환영해 주시도록 부탁드립니다. 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to talk a little bit about what we see in the way of digital changing businesses today. And I was struck by the hologram messages there. 20 years ago, I was doing a PhD in North America working on what was then artificial intelligence. And today, it's now actually all pervasive. And I think that most of us still think that artificial intelligence is something that we see in Hollywood. Actually, artificial intelligence is very much in our everyday business lives. And what we need to do is not just figure out how to harness the technologies, but also understand and predict how it's going to change our business models today. And so what I wanted to talk a little bit about today is the market context and our perspectives. Every business, I believe, should start with their customers. So let's talk about how customers in Asia are changing. And then let's talk a little bit around how some other industries and how some other technology companies are starting to disrupt the existing industries. And then finally, let's talk about how business can respond to that level of innovation. So let's start with the customers. What's happening with customers today? Well, we recognize that consumer habits are changing faster than we think. And we've seen this change over and over again in the last 5 to 10 years. And many companies have not followed that change. In fact, some of the most admired companies in the world, such as Apple, have seen their own business model change and be disintermediated. So when Apple focused on launching not only some outstanding products, but services such as iTunes, then Spotify came along and required the download of music to become redundant and streaming of music to become prevalent. We all know the famous cases of the Kodaks of this world and so on, but it's more around how do you make sure that you're constantly changing with customers' expectations. And one of the most profound changes that we've all seen is the use and adoption of mobile. And I recognize everybody in this room understands that implicitly. But what is more interesting, I think, is much of Asia never went through the move from PC to mobile. It went straight to mobile. And as a consequence, across most of Asia, we see a much higher level of commitment to and trust of purchasing and of interacting on mobile devices. But what is probably most important of all is the importance of social media. Not the importance of social media as we see in the West, not the rise of advertising on social media. I think what we see in Asia is completely different. What we see in Asia is actually an increasing disloyalty of brands, an increasing distrust of media and advertising of the promises, but an increasing trust in peer recommendation. And so the importance of social media in Asia for all businesses is now how to embed peer recommendation into the discovery and the sales cycle for whatever your industry is. I was talking earlier today around in one of the Asian markets recently, we have seen the price of key opinion leaders on social media, which are traditionally celebrities, triple in the last 2 years. And the fastest way of spending your entire marketing budget is to shift all of that into celebrities as key opinion leaders. And as a consequence, what we've seen a large change is how do companies build key opinion leaders of their own from their own customers? How do you enable your own customers to become key opinion leaders for the customers you've not yet got? And building that community and building the ownership of your brand through that community is actually a very different shift. It requires trust and enablement of your brand in other people's hands. Yes, you require some control of that, but actually it means that you change the overall marketing approach to how you talk about your brand and how you capture customers with that brand. And we see it from what we call discovery through to transaction and fulfillment. So discovery is a customer researching your product and that research now is conducted more online now than it ever was before. So we have a client who is a car dealer in Asia. 3 years ago, they had 5.5 or 5.1, visits to the dealership before the customer purchased the car. They now have 1.1 visits to the dealership before they buy the car, because everything else is being conducted online and through peer recommendation. It changes the move of online and digital, as we want to call it, into offline. So digital today in business is not about just what you do online. It's about how you integrate online and offline experiences together. And that is true from research into experience. One of the reasons we have the title Revolutionize Your Experience and Make Tomorrow is that we firmly believe that experience is the key differentiator. And all of our customer research shows that. And what we see as growth here, which is just offers, personalized offers, it's as trivial as it can get in terms of putting a digital experience into a physical environment, is still further ahead in Asia than it is elsewhere. But when you ask a series of other questions about how important is experience, how important is service, then Asia is significantly higher than anywhere else in the world in terms of the value of that experience to the customer. Transaction, we all recognize the rise of mobile payments. I don't need to spend any time on that, but I think what's interesting is the prevalence of mobile payments within the payment cycle. And it is the reason that we have started to see companies like Tencent and Alibaba in China be so successful. So most people refer to Alibaba as one of the world's largest e-commerce companies. Actually, it's one of the world's largest data companies. And the key decision they made to become one of the world's largest e-commerce platforms was solving for payment. Payment traditionally was cash on delivery, check on delivery of the product. And they solved that payment problem by digitizing that. And as a result, dramatically reduced the friction of the customer experience and made it much easier for customers to commit. And it's a trivial example of how we have to be needs-focused in how we approach our digital journey. And finally, sharing around social media and peer recommendation, which I've just mentioned. And so what we're seeing is disruption of all industries, driven in large parts by technology companies, but also driven by partnerships of technology companies with other adjacent industries. And that's true from payments all the way through to food delivery and music streaming, as I mentioned before. The key here is to make sure that we understand where that disruption is coming to our business model. And it's not necessarily to copy it, and we'll talk through some of those examples in a moment. It is the speed of change that is disrupting most of the industries today. It is the ability to reach scale faster today than we've ever had before. And I think most companies recognize that scale of customer engagement is a critical defining point as to whether or not your industry or your company has reached a tipping point into a different direction. And this is a simple chart that plots the time taken in years to reach 100 million users from launch in Asia. Back when feature phones were launched, around 10 years, but now with Line or Didi Dachi in China, around 1 year to reach 100 million customers. And this is accelerating as well. This directly maps to Moore's Law, the doubling of the rate of adoption of technology, and it is exponential. But what's key is it's exponential not in technology, but in consumer adoption, and therefore scale of how readily consumers are willing to move and trust a new technology or a new approach to an industry. And this is even more true, back to the point in the hologram earlier, around what does it mean for the millennial generation. That our millennial customers have a fundamentally different attitude and trust of adopting these technologies, and as a result, it is changing the industry, but it is also changing our need to be able to focus on how do we respond to that. And the money, most important of all, money follows innovation. For the first time in the history of the financial markets that are recorded, financial investment in, and this is private equity and hedge funds and institutional investors, has switched from Silicon Valley to China in this case for the first time. And it is because Asia is the hub of innovation. It is because Asia is able to drive that level of scale adoption that we've seen on the previous slide. And as a result, we are seeing a shift not only in the global financial markets, but also in individual industries as to where the level of disruption is coming from. And to take two examples, China examples of Alibaba and Baidu in this case, actually the vast majority of their money is still made in their domestic market today. And I don't think any of us believe that that is going to be the case in 2 or 3 years' time. So 91% of Alibaba is still, money is still made out of China today. And the vast majority of the rest, the 9%, is actually made through acquisitions they've made overseas. The critical component here is they are starting to push through the rest of Asia. We've seen Alibaba's acquisition of Lazada in Southeast Asia, and we see similar transactions and changes. Why is that important? Well, it's important because their business model is different. For example, the Ant Financial part of Alibaba, the business model they have adopted in financial services is completely different than most of the existing banks and insurance companies in China provide today. And in fact, it's so different that when they launched that service, they were taking micropayments off of the Alipay that people were using on Tmall and Taobao, and they were sweeping that money into savings and offering 8% returns, whereas state-owned banks were offering less than 1%. That gave them scale. From that, they then had a large wealth management opportunity and the ability to manage wealth management funds themselves, the ability to move into insurance. And as a consequence, we see a ripple effect across the whole of financial services that's very difficult for large traditional corporations to respond to. And we've also seen the fact that the CEOs, and we were talking with some this morning, already recognize that need to change. So nearly 70% of CEOs in Asia, compared to their global counterparts, recognize that new market entrants, the Alibabas, the technology innovators of this world, are the most significant threat to their business model today and their competitors today. The speed of technological change clearly is a critical factor, but also the shift in consumer behavior and their spending habits as well. And you'll hear shortly from my colleague, Scott Likens, who leads our emerging tech practice, around how artificial intelligence is also changing the job market today. And because it's changing the job market and consumers' attitudes are changing, it creates potentially a virtual storm of adoption for traditional businesses, both in speed of adoption, cost of adoption, and the size of your own workforce will fundamentally change in the next 2 to 3 years as well. So what are others doing to stay ahead of the game? I'll touch on 4 brief examples, but clearly it touches every industry. The first example is around digital financial services. The second is around how industrial Internet of Things is changing supply chain. And by changing supply chain, we're changing the overall cost base of the industry. And the third is around, in this case, an automotive purchasing experience, but O2O, meaning online to offline purchasing experience, and the after-sales journey. How do you make sure, particularly in the auto industry, where your touch point with the customer is maybe once every 3 years, how do you have a touch point with that customer once every month before they get to the next purchasing cycle decision? And then finally, the importance of partnerships. In this digitally connected world, too many people that we have seen are building silos. They're building their own digital ecosystem. And unless you are able to reach that 100 million customers yourself, actually building your own digital ecosystem is building a silo. It's how do you build a partnership ecosystem and enable customers to plug into that is the true advantage. So the first one to talk about is Asia has one of the fastest growing middle class segments in the world. And there has traditionally been an approach in financial services that has heavily relied on relationship managers and on agents. Agents in the insurance industry, relationship managers in the banking industry, and I, the individual, will take care of you, the customer. I will take care of your needs. So the question then is, what happens if we go direct? What happens if we go direct to customers, not because we as a company want to, but because customers want it? What if we have robo-advisors that are able to advise on an impartial basis? There is a piece of research we conducted recently that showed 75% of consumers are skeptical of the information they are getting from their agent and their relationship manager. Consumers are smart. They are skeptical because they think they're being sold a product. Robo-advice, in part based on artificial intelligence, is here today. We see many financial services deploying this today, and as a result, there is greater consumer adoption because there is greater trust. And one of the things we wanted to talk about is to bring that to life is how we've seen that happen in the insurance industry. And although the video that I'm about to play refers to a series of changes that we have seen amongst our clients in the industry, I think it's actually representative of how the whole industry is changing.
What if insurance companies could help with the big, life-changing experiences and the day-to-day challenges? Could they help us to find a way to be ready for retirement, a new family, and for all the little moments in between? What if they noticed when we were worrying about the future and suggested a better way to structure our investments so that planning for the future was as simple as identifying our priorities and leaning on the wisdom and experience of the whole connected world? What if an integrated budget planning system meant that finding those gorgeous, expensive shoes on sale meant a few more dollars into our rainy day fund without us having to think about it? What if they kept an eye on our personal risk profile and gave us rewards for doing well and an incentive to do better, so that our partners aren't the only ones to keep us on that low-fat diet? What if they could check data from all over the world to identify a need we didn't even know we had, so that when our children are leaving the nest, we can still keep them safe? What if products were created on demand with custom-generated risk assessments for groups big and small, so that our shared passions and worries can be supported and protected? What if they partnered with much-used social platforms, tightening the connection between normal life and financial planning, so that the ability to step into big shoes adds up to more for our passions and plans for the challenges? What if when we reach our goals, they help us to take action and make plans for the next phase, so that we can have the lives we've always wanted? Could an insurance company make it so that living our lives our way is the best way to plan for the future? We think so.
So all of the things you see within that video, from integrated partnerships with people well outside of the insurance industry, from micropayments into micro savings, from social recommendation, from contextual protection, the ability to insure a customer in the moment according to the need they have in the moment. All of these things exist today. They exist in different companies, but where we're seeing the single biggest change is technology companies building insurance businesses that do all of this, and they do all of it with a dramatically different cost base because they no longer need to employ agents and relationship managers to make these things effective. The second area I wanted to talk about was the rise of Internet of Things and industrial Internet of Things and how it's changing supply chain. And one example of this is GE Digital and their Predix platform, but we actually see this across a number of industries. And GE has its origins, obviously, in industrial and heavy industry. And a lot of this is how have they digitized those machines and use analytics and predictive modeling to forecast where the failures might happen, where there are optimization in the supply chain. Amazon have something similar in being able to forecast where the demand for a product is going to be and move that product much closer to the last mile to the customer and therefore increase rapid response times. Alibaba has done something similar in China. On 11/11, the largest e-commerce trading day in China just recently, the fastest product ordered on Tmall was delivered to a customer in 30 minutes from the time of order. Now, it is critical if we are changing the supply chain and changing distribution of physical products to customers that we actually understand how to digitize that process. And part of that digitization isn't just around equipping each part of the value chain with digital technology, such as Internet of Things. It's also about being able to track and engage those products through the life of the delivery to the customer. And in fact, one example right here is we're fundamentally changing how the retail industry carries out its orders. So currently today, you have designers in New York and Europe and wherever else, and they're designing the clothes. They will then go to third-party companies such as our client, and they will ask them to cost how much it'll make to produce that clothing, and then they will iterate that process several times until they get to the right design for the right price in the right time. In that industry today, it typically takes about 180 days from the time of designing, let's say, a shirt to the time it is produced and delivered. That can get down to less than 20 days using this type of approach. That removes a massive amount of cost and time from the supply chain process. But most importantly of all, it puts you closer to the customer. It puts you closer to the customer's trends. So when customers are changing their habits, changing their preferences, the ability to respond to that is much faster. You remove latency from the system. The next is the automotive experience. And most people talk about Tesla, and we focus on the engineering side of Tesla. But what I think Tesla has done in a very interesting way is change the customer experience of buying the car. In fact, I myself have bought a Tesla over a mobile phone, or reserved a Tesla over a mobile phone. Never visited a shop, did it all over the mobile. There are only 3 different options you could pick within that and place your order for a future delivery time. Most importantly of all, they then are able to keep in touch with you throughout that build process, but also through the service process. We now see more traditional automotive manufacturers following the same approach and embracing things like virtual reality to be able to better simulate exactly what your customized version of that car would look like. To be able to predict demand that says, yes, you can order this model today and it will go into production and it'll arrive in 6 months. Or you can order the variant that I've already got on my showroom and you can have it within 6 days. And that ability to forecast and move stock around, particularly when you have significant inventory, is a critical component to how you change the cost base of your company. And finally, Asia Miles as an example. So we all recognize air miles as loyalty schemes today. And all I'm trying to do here is illustrate the point of partnerships. If you're building a digital ecosystem that is designed to reward and engage your customers with some form of loyalty, it is also critical that you offer more than just your business. It's more important to be able to offer a digital ecosystem to the customer. And in Asia Miles' case, they've plugged into a huge range of service providers, into a range of travel providers, into a range of retail and consumer providers where you can trade Asia Miles. What if we thought of loyalty not as loyalty to a company, but as a trading commodity? Scott will talk in a moment around blockchain and how blockchain is revolutionizing a large number of industries. Actually, if you created a cryptocurrency around loyalty points, if you enabled this opportunity to plug into a digital ecosystem that wasn't just about your points for your customers that are redeemed only for your product, but actually a tradable currency of loyalty, then you build a much broader platform on which customers can engage. You are much more likely to increase the level of engagement. So when we talk about consumers and we talk about disrupting business models, we're talking about both supply chain and operations changing to a completely different cost base and speed. And we're talking about customers changing both their purchasing habits, but how they want to be rewarded. What is clear in the last 10 years, where much of Asia has pivoted to focus on customer relationship management, where much of our clients are focused on how do I have a more loyal customer in a less loyal world, actually the answer to that is not build your own loyalty platform and hope they will come. The answer is how do you increase the frequency of contact with your customer? The answer lies in how do I create a digital ecosystem with partners that enable me to reward the customer? And the answer is also, how do I move away from this idea that if you stay with me long enough, you'll get a reward in the future? So all of the tier platforms we see today, all of the you will achieve VIP status once you've bought 500,000 yuan worth of product, all of the things that we see that are around rewarding you in the future once you've spent enough money with me are changing. How do you create more immediate rewards based on the ecosystem that's there? And how do you create more frequent engagement with those customers? So what are the innovation opportunities? Well, I think one of the things that we see most importantly of all is that actually businesses are struggling to react to the change that we see in the market today. We see that businesses adopt a huge desire to evolve their business model. We see that they adopt a range of techniques and technologies internally to try and change. But actually what we've not seen is a significant enough change of the ways of working. If you keep doing the same thing, but in a slightly different way, you're likely to get the same result. So how do you change the innovation model within a corporate? Well, broadly speaking, we see there are three ways that companies have responded. The first is to borrow ideas and borrow innovation. The second is to buy it. And the third is to build it. And they all have merits depending on the type of company that you are. So borrowing is kind of the try before you buy model. Borrowing is about working with startups and accelerators. Borrowing is also about gaining access to new markets and new customers. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Buying is buying into the startup community. How do big corporates work with the startup communities? How do you make sure that you are actually engaged with them in a way that drives innovation for you rather than just for them? And how do you acquire those new capabilities? The one thing we have seen time and time again is an ability for companies to acquire innovation and kill it within 6 to 12 months. And the reason they kill it is not because the underlying ideas aren't good, not because the underlying technologies aren't good, but because of culture. And PwC goes through the same revolution that all of the other industries have gone through. We have gone into acquiring agencies. We've gone into acquiring creative talent. And the reason we have creative talent is because if you're helping customers from a journey of strategy through to execution, you have to have creativity, engagement, brand, and the ability to prototype those ideas in very rapid form. I can tell you, being very honest, there is no bigger cultural difference than taking a bunch of agency people who have ripped jeans and T-shirts and draw on boards and put them in a company that's full of accountants and suits and ties and the needs to work in a very structured fashion. It is one of the single most important challenges that any company has is cultural integration. We have spent a huge proportion of our time focusing not on the underlying service or product that these individuals bring, but instead on the cultural integration. And that is the reason why acquisition of innovation often fails within big corporates, is because they spend so much time on the individual idea or the technology and nowhere near enough time focusing on the cultural integration of that. And finally, there is build. There is obviously the ability to develop internal innovation capabilities. And we've seen a rise of what we call the intrapreneur or the enterprise entrepreneur. People who come in who are chief innovation officer, chief digital officer, people who are there to drive fundamental change within the business. They often build specific teams. Sometimes teams in isolations. We see the phrase innovation lab pop up a lot throughout Asia. The number of clients we have who have innovation labs is very high. Whether or not those innovation labs make a fundamental change to the business is more about how that lab is integrated back into the core business than it is about whether or not the labs have good ideas. The other thing I would say about those innovation labs is there is often a massive loss of talent. And so you go through an excitement curve. The innovation lab is created. You've recruited some talent into your company that your company's never had before. Huge excitement. You have an entrepreneur in residence. Even more excitement. They start working. Okay, well, we'll give them some time. The first few ideas don't work. That's agile development. That is the very definition of agile development, is that a lot more projects will fail than will succeed. It is about the speed in which you create the projects and then shut them down if they're not working, rather than the fear of failure, which is endemic in most corporations. And often, when they get through that cycle and they've not managed to achieve 10, 20 stellar projects, then the company says, well, the innovation lab doesn't work for us, and they shut it down, and we go through a 5-year period before then it comes into fashion again and they start up another innovation lab. The key is not whether it's an innovation lab or not. That's more about whether that model fits for your company. The key is about how do you embed agile development into the rest of the corporation, and that will determine whether or not the innovation cycle is successful. So to talk a little bit about what those opportunities, those innovation opportunities are. Corporate venture capital, innovation and digital labs, and accelerators and incubators. So corporate venture capital is relatively obvious. It is about how do you take the money you have within your corporation and buy make an acquisition of innovation or of technology. You know, there are many opportunities that arise from that, apart from the fact that you're hunting for the same technology that everybody else is hunting for in your industry as well. So we tend to see significant valuations, if not over valuations, of those businesses within those industries. And so corporate venture capital is very logical, but it's also a very difficult road in which to embed the innovation back into the business. Innovation and digital labs, we see a lot of that, and I've talked a bit already around those models of those digital labs. I think for us the key is how do you embed the agility that is born in those labs back into the business. So I was talking earlier today to a group of executives about what does agility mean. Well, in our world, agility means we need to understand what the customer needs are, not what your customers buy from you today. Understand what the customer needs are, ideate and prototype against those needs, not against what your company does. And then test that prototype. Take it back to them. And particularly because we're talking about digital services, we're talking about building prototypes and testing them in days and weeks, not months. And only then, when you've already got validation of that customer engagement with that proposition, do you invest the significant money to build it. That cycle of customer needs through to prototype development, through to testing, and the business case that goes with that to move to the next phase, we frequently do with our client in 8 weeks. And those 8-week sprints are the sprints that need to get embedded within corporations based on the innovation and digital lab model. The final one is accelerators and incubators. So I hope many of you are familiar with this, but accelerators are effectively events where corporations will plug into the startup community. They will set that community a challenge, or they will be looking for a specific set of attributes around that community. So, for example, what is the next innovation in digital healthcare? What is the next innovation in automotive disruption? And those accelerators, those startups then work for a prize, effectively, to help accelerate those models. We've seen one car company spend 5 years trying to develop an electric bike that will fit in the boot of their car that they can sell as an optional extra for when you've driven to the bar and you've had too much to drink and you still need a way home. They spent 5 years doing that. Through an accelerator, they found a company who was already producing those bikes, and they put them in the cars, and they went from the start of the accelerator program to offering this as an optional extra in their cars in less than 6 months. and they'd spent 5 years doing it. Accelerators can be very powerful tools. We manage accelerators on behalf of our clients on a regular basis. I think the challenge is being very specific about the area of disruption that you're looking for them to solve. And incubators operate in much the same way. So finally, I wanted to talk about what are the pros and cons of some of those models. So the corporate venture capital does increase innovation. It does enable you to gain insights, particularly if you are moving into a new market. So if you're moving into a new market, if there are uncertain returns from that market, and they give you an ability to diversify your business effectively. And that diversification can be extremely powerful. The challenge with it is that often it leads to increased commitment. It's rarely the first acquisition that's the one that solves all problems, and therefore it leads to increasing capital demand. And it also involves this corporate culture clash. And in many cases, we've used the word resentment here. We've seen many cases of resentment between, all of the cool new digital stuff is going on in this venture over here. That means I'm left to run the legacy business. And it causes a significant people challenge in the legacy business. And it also, most importantly of all, really doesn't embed innovation back into your business. What it does is it says, I'm going to run my traditional business model here, and I'm going to run my new business model over there. For some corporations, that makes sense. For a lot of corporations, you are effectively outsourcing innovation and trusting that that acquisition will take the corporation to the next level. The innovation and the digital lab are very much about how do you create that innovation in-house, but recognize that the cultural needs of innovation may be different from your corporation. This is particularly true in financial services. So financial services, heavily regulated market, requires a huge amount of operational discipline. The type of people that have been recruited into financial services over the years tends not to be the people who can then go and build a startup tomorrow with a new innovative digital business model. It's not to say they can't, it's just often not the training that they've had, and it's not the mindset that they've had around this opportunity of failing fast. And I deliberately use that term opportunity. Failing fast is an opportunity. It is the very definition of agility. And as a consequence, a lot of what we're focused on is how does that innovation and digital lab respond with agility, respond with that need to be able to consolidate both creativity and data, and finally, culture, talented people, put those three things together. If you cannot put together creativity, data, and culture, then the innovation and the digital lab will fail. The downsides of these things is it does require experts. We often see a lot of rejection from the corporation of that culture. And I think that cultural change is a critical part of making sure that senior management must sponsor it. This must be a CEO, not even the CTO. It must be the CEO that sponsors the venture, because there must be very clear commitment to the rest of the organization that we are committed to the change in culture, that we are committed to agile development, and that we are committed to trying to find an alternative business model. It's not to say we've given up on the existing business model, but it's a critical component of saying, how do we make sure the new business model is something that we can explore without fear of failure? And we need to be able to do that in a way that means that we can continue to innovate rather than point fingers at whether or not that the latest project has been a success. The final accelerator. Accelerator is probably the easiest form of innovation in terms of being able to spin it up very quickly. It's very cost effective, and it has an ability to generate significant opportunity as a result. But most companies that we talk to are talking about innovators and accelerators. Most companies that are running accelerators are not the only people in their industry doing it. There is a finite number of startup companies out there. Therefore, there is a finite number of new ideas you're going to get through your accelerator versus your competitor's accelerator. So I think too many people perhaps go into accelerators with the expectation that it's going to solve the problem. And I think there needs to be a sense of reality check the fact that you're all trying to go after the same group of startup communities within your industry. And therefore, what is it that you have to offer as a company that's different from your competitors? And I can say, in my opinion, the biggest mistake those companies make is what they try to create as a differentiation is, we're going to reward you more for your innovation. That is not how the innovators work. Most importantly of all, it's not what's going to be most successful. What's going to be most successful is if you can figure out how your company offers something, offers a platform to that startup that they won't get elsewhere, offers a route to new customers that they wouldn't get elsewhere, offers a route to taking their technology and plugging it in with your technology and together creating a differentiation. That's what will create the opportunity in the market rather than simply money. So I don't want to finish on a negative, I actually want to finish on a positive. All of these are how we see corporations responding to that digital change. All of them are critical components in the next step, but all of them have to be anchored in the fact that consumers are changing, the workforce is changing, and the business model disruption that's happening today is unlikely to come from the competitors in your industry, but instead from adjacent industries that you may or may not have seen. With that, I thank you for your time.